if you're listening now and you're just doing your first or second deal, don't let this scare you, because the chances of it happening are low, and you can always, tighten up your agreements. Do your first deal, because real estate is one of the best things you can do. I think the message here is just make sure the expectations are set, and just make sure you're covering your asset and yourself in the eventuality that something does happen. But yeah, do not let this hold you back at all.
This is the real estate investing experience. We get it. Real estate can be rough sometimes, and that's why we bring in the experts to talk about the experiences you won't hear anywhere else, with your hosts, John Cohen and Chris Grinzik.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Real Estate Investing Experience. I'm your host, Chris Grinzik, and with me, as always, is John Cohen. How are we doing, bud?
We are good. We're rolling. We are experiencing a little surgery hangover, but what I thought wasn't painful became a little bit more painful as the day went on.
You sure it's not just recording 3 episodes back to back with me, and it's actually the surgery?
That's a nice way of putting it, right? It's, quote unquote surgery. Meanwhile, yeah. It's my co-host. But no, it's been fun, right? I've been standing, sitting, trying to mix it up, but we're good. Other than that, I got no complaints. I thought it was going to be much worse, so I can deal with it.
Yeah. There is something to be said, though, about like the not super painful, just like, I don't want to say like agony, but like just the dull pain of constantly being there and you can't like shift and get away from it. So I do not envy you right now.
So that you just nailed it. It's not like a cringing pain, like I'm down and out for the count. It's just like a dull pain that won't go away. So it's like, it's annoying more than anything. It doesn't hurt. It's just there, right? It's like imagine someone's like poking you all day. It's like, come on, like enough of this shit. Let's go.
Well, you got a 2-year-old. She probably does that anyway.
Well, that's the part, she wants to jump on my back and she wants to roll around on the floor. And I'm like, I'm injured right now. Like I'll do it to the best that I can, but they tell, don't pick up anything, don't do this, which I'm breaking all the rules I'm supposed to. But
you're supposed to use it as a convenient excuse to foster it all off on your wife.
That the doctor said she said for the next 24 hours, you're king. And my wife is like, no.
Yeah, right. She was never letting that slide, let's be honest.
Nope. I came home. I was like, I can't do anything for 24 hours.
She just had a list of stuff for you to do.
No, she's been great. She's, the wound is not fun and she has to like pack it with gauze. Mm-hmm. So I give her a ton of credit this morning. It was a very compromising position. Let's put it that way.
All right, maybe we'll just leave it there. We won't go into it any further.
No, onto our
I definitely don't want to hear it anymore. So fantastic. But hopefully next week you'll be feeling better. So we'll see how it goes. But let's jump into today's episode. We got a great guest on today. Excited to hear his story, learn about him, learn from him, just kind of overall just have a really great chat. So with that being said, Seth, thank you so much for coming on, bud.
Hey, thanks, guys. I'm left with more questions than answers right now after that introduction.
It's fine. See, this is what we do. We do like vague and somewhat informative intro, so people got to listen to every single episode. So if they want to stay up to date, they got to go back and listen to them all. So that's how we keep people hooked. We leave cliffhangers along the way, kind of like TV shows. So if you're a Game of Thrones,
yeah, as long as it's not the last season of Game of Thrones, we're good.
Yeah, that's fine. This is never ending. We're always going to do it forever and ever.
We're going to do it, and you're going to have to listen to everyone to hear all the nuances.
Exactly. But Seth, kick us off a little bit. Tell everybody a little bit about, you, your background, your journey, and, what you do, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been in the real estate game for 13 years now in several different areas. But before real estate even got started, I wanted to become an NHL hockey referee, believe it or not. That was my dream. So I spent a number of years working some pro and junior hockey, and real estate wasn't even on the radar. But then I realized that I needed a real job because my window was closing and the dream was not going to happen. So the cool thing is, though, if I turn on the TV on any night, there's a ton of guys who I work with that are now, in the NHL. So that's pretty cool. So then I got into real estate sales. So became a real estate broker, did really, really well with that. But then, I'm sure lots of your guests talk about Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad and growing something. I fell into the trap he talks about where you have all these expenses. So I had the really fancy car. I had a 4-bedroom house with a pool all to myself. I had all these expenses. So my income was really good, but then it was going out just as fast. And then I just felt like I was spinning my wheels and I wasn't really building anything, and I had nothing to show for it except for all these expenses. So then I started buying single family homes and did that. Then it wasn't scaling how I wanted. The cash flow wasn't where it needed to be. And then I'm sure we'll talk about this later on, but I lost the single family portfolio. It crumbled. And then I used that to get into the multifamily side. So that's a little bit of a snapshot into where I'm at. And it's been a whole lot of fun. It's been a wild ride.
Yeah. So I do want to touch on something first, because, that I'll say living at your means is something that's very unnatural to me, because my parents were the complete opposite. And so I was just raised where spending money on things I think are stupid is just, I don't do. The only things I spend a little bit more money on than I should is my car, but I bought it, and my rent. I could probably be a little bit cheaper, but again, I just like coming back to where I am. What was it like for you when you kind of realize hey, I'm making great money, but I'm not saving anything, so it doesn't matter, and making that change? Was there a big learning curve? Was it a kick in the teeth? Was it you had to surround yourself with different people? What was that process like for you?
Well, I think it was just a big oh shit moment, right? It came along with me getting more educated in how money works. Before, my father had owned a couple businesses, and as you start getting successful in the real estate sales game, he's like, oh, you need to drive a really nice car because that's expected. So I'm like, okay. So I went out and bought a really nice car. Then it's like, oh, you should buy a house. Okay. So I went out and bought a house, but I wasn't thinking down the road. I was just thinking for today. So, I was told to buy a nice car. So I got one, or I leased it. And then, oh, you need a really nice house. So I went out and bought one. Then I upgraded that house, but I wasn't really thinking about how the moves I was making then would impact my life and my future opportunities 10 years down the road. So it was just, I think a lot of people, they see other people doing stuff, so they buy it. And of course, as a young guy, you like to drive a nice car, and it's nice to brag about, but there was no rhyme or reason. I was just uneducated about how finances and money works. And if I could have gone back in time, I would have bought a duplex house, rented the basement out, had that pay off a significant part of my mortgage. I just would have done things so much differently, but I didn't know. There was nobody in my circle. Even though I was selling real estate, I like to say I was very uneducated about the business of real estate. So I just didn't have the network around me. I didn't know, I wasn't reading about it. And as soon as I started learning about how I can use real estate as a tool and how money actually works, I just looked back and said, oh, what am I doing? and I started trying to change things pretty quickly.
It's interesting. That's something that resonates well with me, because my brother and myself were complete opposites, right? My brother's, party all day and, work when I'm not partying. I was always, I always looked at it saying, I want to work really hard and then retire early or not have to work as much and later in life. But the real estate for me, when I first started buying properties, I look back at some of those properties now and I say, fuck, man, I should have held that, right? But at the time, the education is way more out there today, and Chris talked about that, than it ever was. But even with all the education out there and people see that, I still don't think people are using it to their ability, because like you said, there's so much out there for people today that I couldn't even fathom, right? There was no such thing as a podcast when I was growing up, well, there probably was, but they weren't as rampant, or the information was reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, which I never did, or it was stuff like that you had to stumble across and do it on your own. I mean, even, my grandfather owned property and I just saw it. I said, wow, collecting rent every month is great, but it was never really drilled into anybody at a super young age. And it's more so now. And I think it's such a void that's missing for anyone, whether they're, a 10-year-old or, a 50-year-old. I think that there's so much power in what you can do with real estate that can set you up for so much more in the future if we would have all have known, which I think is, a thing that you bring up and you admit. And I think people have to hear that so that they can start going down that path to better serve themselves.
Yeah, 100%. And the other thing I learned too is, when I finally realized I needed to start building a portfolio, I just started buying property that I was selling on a day-to-day basis. There was no rhyme or reason to the assets I was buying. I was just buying it because I knew the product. But that was a mistake in itself too, because I wasn't thinking about what I wanted my life to look like 10 years down the road. And if I would have taken the time to really think about that, I would have started buying different properties and had different strategies. But I was just buying property because it was there. And I think that's where a lot of people, that they get into trouble too, that they don't appreciate the decisions you make today will have an impact on where you end up in the future. So, it's always like, in order to have a future, you have to know the road to get there. And by going through that process of planning out where you want to be, it'll help keep you more focused, because, lots of entrepreneurs, they get the shiny object syndrome. So by having that plan and that goal, it allows you to kind of stay on the path instead of getting, sidetracked here and there.
100%. I think something that was really interesting for me was I never knew how people calculated what mortgage you would qualify for. I just never looked it up because I really had no desire to buy a house. I was like, I'm just going to rent for a while because I don't want to put the capital down, and also just self-employed. So I know that adds another wrinkle. But I finally looked it up not too long ago, and I actually did the math on like what I could afford, and I was shocked at the price of a house I could afford to buy and what the payment would be. And it like made me sick of like how much money I would qualify to spend every month in housing based on what a mortgage company says. Because for me, it was like double or triple what I was paying in rent. And I was like, that's ridiculous. Because I feel like I'm already paying, I said it right in the beginning, I feel like I'm paying too much on my rent as it is. And it's such a low percentage compared to what the society and the mortgage industry deems as norm. And I think about it and I sit there going, okay, well, if they're telling me I can go higher and I feel sick that I could go that high, most people are not going to feel that way, because they're just going to say, oh, what loan, I want to buy a house. What loan do I qualify for? Mortgage broker tells you qualify for $500,000. You're like, great, I'm going to go buy a $500,000 house with 20% down, or, 600 with 5%, whatever the math equates to. And nobody ever like reverse engineers it of like, hey, just because I can get this much debt, should I get this much debt? And just because I can, technically afford to pay this much in mortgage payments or even rent, should I pay this much in mortgage payments or rent? Like I've already said it before, most people, when they qualify tenants, and now that I'm doing the property management, is usually somewhere from 2.5 to 3 times rent on a monthly basis. I really would love to do a higher one, not only because it makes it less risky, but I think that's just what it should be. Like that's 3 times before any taxes are taken out. I really think most people should be doing closer to like 4 times. But I know if I ever did that, I would never get tenants. It would be so tough because people don't expect that, right? If they make $3,000 a month, they're looking roughly for $1,000 in rent because they know that's what they can get. And most people don't reverse it the other way. And it's just like, I just sit there and I'm just like, if this is how 95% of the population thinks, it's just mind boggling to me.
Yeah. And in some markets it's tough. So, if somebody hasn't picked up on my Canadian accent yet, so I live just outside of Toronto. The average house price in the GTA is $1 million. So like, if you want to live in that area, you're spending for a house, like you're spending, 900 million, 1.1, 1.2. And that's just for your average type of home. Imagine the mortgage payment that goes along with that. Rent, like to rent a house like that, it's like $3,000 a month. And I think, going back, if I could change anything, So I started acquiring these properties in the GTA. So the cash flow yield was not there. I was equity rich, cash flow poor. Um, I didn't even think of, renting where I was living and then investing in a different market that would actually yield, a better, better cash flow. It didn't even enter into my mind. So I was very closed in my thinking. But yeah, if somebody's in a tough market like that, there's no rule that says you have to own your real estate where you're living. Like you can rent, you can buy property somewhere else. Just think outside the box. Don't constrain yourself to just where you're living.
100%. So you said something about your single family stuff about, you ran into some trouble or you lost it or something like
Oh
that.
yeah.
What happened there?
Yeah. So I was my romantic partner at the time, and I were buying these properties, and she had some issues going on, and let's just say she wiped out the bank accounts one night, changed the locks on the house, took the car, cut up my clothes, and told me I would never see my son again. So basically what we had, and this kind of shows how important cash flow is, because we had some vacancies in the portfolio, and the bank accounts were wiped out. So all our reserves were gone. She took it. So we had these vacancies. The money wasn't there from the reserves to cover the mortgage payments. She was refusing to sign on leases to put new people in, and because we were both on title. So very quickly it spiraled into a very bad situation, because we didn't have enough rent coming in to cover the payments, and things got pretty ugly. And then trying to force the sale just to get out of it through the court process took a very long time, and it did quite a bit of damage. And I'm still, years and years later, I'm still trying to get all the money back she stole. So that was a big wake up call for a couple different reasons. The first one is, whenever you're entering into real estate partnerships, have agreements in writing on paper, with contingencies in place for what if scenarios. I learned my lesson. We didn't, we were together at the time. We didn't think about anything going wrong. I didn't imagine somebody would just go rogue and just take everything and leave. So there was nothing in place to protect me or to protect the portfolio, or allow one of the parties to take action in the event something did happen like that. So lots of times people will enter into real estate partnerships, but once if one person just disappears for a month and something important has to happen with the portfolio, that should be outlined in the agreement, being like, okay, well, after 30 days of non-performance of your duties or whatever, like, I'm able to take this action, whether it's, some sort of shotgun clause where they're able to be bought out, just something like that. Think of the worst case scenario. The other thing it showed me was how quickly things can spiral out of control when there's little cash flow. The market was fine at the time, but it was just the portfolio we had built. There was a lot of equity there because it was a high growth market. But without the cash flow, real estate dies, and the cash flow to service that debt payment, it wasn't strong at all. So that really highlighted the weakness of some vacancies in the havoc it can play, especially with all the other factors going on at the same time.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think you just highlighted two important parts of like the overarching theme of like, hey, you've got to analyze the downside, and it's not only on the deal level, but it's also on the partnership level, right?
Yeah.
Where you're saying like, hey, cash flow is light. Well, I would imagine, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but going into those deals, you probably didn't look at, hey, what happens if we go to 10% vacancy or 15, or what's our break even number that it cash, at least it pays for itself type of thing, which is a huge important thing, because, that's something we look at all the time is, okay, what does our income have to fall to, or what can our expenses grow to that at least we're breaking even every month? And we're usually in the 60 to 80% range of income, including the mortgage. So that's something we always look at, but it's also too, on the partnership side, something that really needs to be analyzed. When I did these first two deals with my family, I think people have been shocked at the level of detail that we've gone into on the agreements and the loans of like, hey, what's the very unlikely but worst case scenario type of thing, where we spent a lot of time making sure the agreements were in place because I'm here doing the day to day. What happens if I die? What happens if I become incapacitated? What happens if, other things happen, or, if I'm doing a bad job, or if somebody wants to sell and somebody doesn't? We spent a long time looking at those things because that stuff happens. And it's, one, through my experience, just the last 5 years of, some things here and there, luckily nothing to the level that you've experienced. But also, my parents have had stuff that has gone poorly in both, professional and their personal lives as well. So I think it's hugely important where even if it's your best friend, sibling, a parent, there's nothing wrong with spending a little extra money and time and never needing it, but God forbid you do. It's so important to have.
Yeah, I call that my $1 million mistake. So save yourself $1 million and hire a lawyer to draft up some sort of agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And look, going through the great thing too about going through that exercise, when you intentionally try to poke holes in a business plan, in a deal, in a partnership, it can expose some things you might have taken for granted or overlooked, or maybe one person had a certain expectation and somebody else had another one, and you didn't realize that you hadn't talked about something, or your expectations weren't quite the same. Because sometimes, a lot of times we fall into that fallacy of like, hey, even if you talked about it, the comprehension on the other side may not have been there. And that means that you didn't communicate it effectively, and they didn't either ask questions or communicate that they understood it. And that lack of expectations is where a lot of things fall apart in the future, right? Like, you may enter into an agreement and you put your last nickel in and somebody else doesn't. And what happens if, you need to cover the mortgage? They may think it's, hey, we're 50-50 partners, so you got to come up with the money halfway, but you may have been like, hey, I'm putting everything I have, so I can't do it type of thing. And if you don't talk about that beforehand, you hope it never happens. But if it does, that's going to be a really tough conversation.
Yeah. And especially, life circumstances can change over 5, 10, 15 years, depending on how long you're holding the properties.
Yeah.
And if it's a longer term hold with your family, maybe at year 15, somebody who was thinking about retirement or something that wasn't even on the plate when they were 40 and first got into the deal. So, what's the process of buying that partner out if that's an option? Or like you said, if somebody's not performing, how do you kick that person out of the partnership? Like, how do you get them out in the cleanest, most efficient way? Mm-hmm. All of these things can save so much time and frustration. And, I hope nobody, has somebody wipe out everything on them. But if it does happen, just make sure you're prepared, because it does happen. And the more I talk about it, like, people will actually send me a message and say, hey, listen, like, the same thing happened to me, but nobody talks about it. Right. So I think it's important just to share the message and just make people realize, like, these worst case scenarios, they're unlikely. There's like a 1% chance, but when it does, it'll hit you like a ton of bricks.
So that's one thing that my dad, who happens to be an attorney, he put in an agreement of, it was actually my brother's company at the time, which at the end of the day, listen, if you're just getting into real estate, you don't want to spend all the time with the attorney and not buy anything, right? There is a delicate balance. I'm just playing the devil's advocate side. Anybody could spend days, hours, and thousands of dollars making the perfect agreement, but if you never buy a deal, it's wasted money. But one little thing that you may want to consider when putting these agreements together, is any type of buyout agreement that basically says, let's say it's two people, 50-50, you could put an agreement in there that if an offer is made, you have to either buy me out or I buy you out at that offer. So, me and Seth are partners, and 2 years down the road, we just, it's not working, right? It's going to blow up in our face. I'll buy you out for $100,000. I make an offer that I'm willing to pay. And if you think it's a better offer, you give me $100,000. So it's an easy trigger without going to reinvent the wheel. Because at the end of the day, you want to make sure it's good, but you also want to be in the game, because nobody wants what happened to you to happen to anybody else. And I have horror stories of partners passing away and their new partner steals the money, and gone. It happened to me, right? Where a guy passed away. That was my contact. The two other partners in the deal, I didn't even know about. And I'm relatively experienced. Next thing I know, the money's gone. So it happens to everybody. There's triggers and things that you could put in there, but something as small as that, as at least it puts a level of credit fact checking in there, right? Like, oh, I'm going to make an offer of 500 grand because it's worth 200. Well, then you say, fine, buy me out for 500 grand. So it puts, if there's ever a disagreement or something that doesn't get along, at least there's an easy mechanism to get rid of the partnership. So something easy as that could be a low hanging fruit that doesn't reinvent the wheel. So keep that in mind. You don't want to go too sophisticated, but at the same time, you want to protect your downside.
Yeah, well, 100%. I think that's really good advice.
Yeah, I think too, right? Where, John, to your point, right? Trying to put together the perfect agreement is something that shouldn't hold you back. So if it's like, hey, put something together, talk through it. And if you realize there are holes or things missing in the future, will then come together with your partners at that time and then either make an amendment or, redo it or something if you feel it's that big. Like, just because you have one agreement in place doesn't mean in 2 years you can't add to it, make changes, do different things if you see something wrong. So you're 100% right. Don't delay buying a deal because you don't feel every single loophole is closed. No agreement is perfect. And at the end of the day, an agreement's only as good as its ability to be enforced and somebody enforcing it. So, do as best you can and then just make it better as you go forward. So I think it is important because people will get wrapped up in that.
Yes. And then keep in mind, you want to have any amendment conversations prior to shit hitting the fan, right? Yeah. So anyone that's listening, dive in head first with no agreement, but make sure that's at the top of your list while there's still a friendship, a bond, a relationship, because 100%. When shit goes sideways, that's what you want the agreement for. So you can buy a deal together and then, okay, hey, if this happens, at least write it down so there's some framework. Because when shit hits the fan, if you think you're going to amend something in your favor or out of your favor, that, most likely that's when people are going to bring their, everyone's going to put their boxing gloves on and it's going to be time to throw some haymakers. So just keep that in mind. When you're making an amendment, do it in the fashion that will be the easiest way to the easiest path through is when there's no problems.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. As soon as shit hits the fan, it's funny how quickly stories and reality changes if it's not on paper. So, but yeah, like John, like you're saying, if you're listening now and you're just doing your first or second deal, don't let this scare you because the chances of it happening are low, and you can always, tighten up your agreements. Do your first deal because real estate is one of the best things you can do. I think the message here is just make sure the expectations are set and just make sure you're covering your asset and yourself in the eventuality that something does happen. But yeah, do not let this hold you back at all.
No, it's just another thing to refine and get better as you go forward. So don't let it hold you back. So after the single family stuff, and all that, one, why didn't you just say, fuck this, I'm out? And two, of just real estate in general. And two, how did you pivot? How did you change? What did you do from there?
Yeah. So those are good questions. So why didn't I just say, fuck this? Well, I thought about it. That's the honest answer. Mm-hmm. There was a pretty rough period of time there because I had literally nothing. And I lost a whole lot. So I think, and it took me a little bit to bounce back from that. But in a way it was probably one of the best things I did because getting out of that relationship, even though it exploded in a tremendous style, like it was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. And then from that, I realized I was starting from ground zero. Like I was negative dollars. I had no car. I had nothing. But that's where, my podcast came from, with real estate. That's how, the TV show came about. So all these things that having nothing forced me to do have been a huge benefit. Like now next year, I'm running a huge conference in Toronto about multifamily real estate. We got Kevin O'Leary coming in. We got lots of great stuff. None of that would have happened if I didn't, lose it all and have to rebuild. Mm-hmm. So I think, it was one of the worst things ever happened to happen to me, but in a way it was also one of the best things. But how the whole shift into multifamily happened was I remember when my son was born. So my son was born about a year before everything hit the fan. And I remember, holding him for the first time, and I knew I needed. It's kind of funny, like if you have kids, you'll understand, John. I'm sure you might have gone through something similar, but like as soon as you hold your kid in your arms, like it's like a switch flips, and like you have to be better and do better, not for yourself anymore, but for somebody else. And that happened with me. So my mind started going like, I knew real estate. I made more money with my portfolio than I had, just working in selling houses. So I knew I needed to acquire more property, but I was constrained with the financing. I was constrained with, the scalability of the portfolio. The cash flow was a big issue. So I knew real estate was the answer, but it was just the wrong type of real estate that I was acquiring. So I looked at all my different options, and multifamily to me seemed like a really good fit. So in my mind, it's like, okay, we have to do this. And then as soon as I figured that out, everything hit the fan and I lost it. So I knew where I wanted to go. I just no longer had the resources to make it happen. So that was pretty rough, but yeah, like, I basically started from scratch, and, the podcast, TV show, the other stuff I'm doing, that it all came out of that. And I think now I'm a much better person. I'm a lot clearer in where I'm thinking, because in one way it allowed me to shed all that weight the single family portfolio had and my old way of thinking, and it really forced me to be a lot more creative and see things differently. Switching gears.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. You said something that I say a lot differently, and the way I always tell people, and you lived it basically, was when you're looking at real estate and you want to figure out what to do, right? What type of strategy, what type of asset class, where, whatever, you got to start with what you're looking to achieve, and then back into what's going to best help you achieve that. And too many people, I think, get limited in the quote unquote types or strategies. And I try to encourage people to look at more. So I'll say, like, go look up 5 asset classes and 5 strategies for each of those asset classes, and then figure out what the pros and cons are of each. Because by doing that exercise, you're going to see, like, okay, this one has really good tax benefits. This one isn't. This one's going to have really good appreciation. This one isn't, cash flow, this and that. And you're going to kind of just start to figure out, like, as you're going through this research and doing things, of what is going to best suit you today, and start to weed out a lot of those things that you might have thought would be great, right? Because everybody starts by flipping, basically, because of HGTV, or because they know single family, or they're an agent, right? That's very easy. Or they invest in single family because somebody they know is a landlord, and it's like 80% of landlords own one extra house or something like that. So that's kind of which is they naturally fall into, but they don't realize there's so many different avenues. Even just wholesaling or flipping, I mean, we've had dozens of people on that do slightly different strategies in different ways, even to the way we have somebody on that they flip mobile home parks without ever owning the land, which I think is a really unique and interesting strategy. So there's a lot of pros and cons to all these different things, but if you don't know what you're trying to achieve first, it's going to be really tough to figure out what you should or shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way you structure it, the way you build your portfolio, like there's a million different ways you can do it. I've had a guy on my podcast, his dream was to run his portfolio from a pub in Ireland. So the decisions he's going to make, and how the types of properties, his hierarchy in terms of management, the tools, everything surrounding his portfolio is geared towards running his portfolio from a pub in Ireland. That's going to be very different to the decisions I'm going to make, because I don't share that end goal he's aiming towards. So it's, and I think like that is one of the biggest, besides getting involved with the wrong person who was crazy, I would say that's the other biggest mistake I made, is not thinking ahead. And you bring up so many good points. If somebody's getting started, take a couple days or a week or a couple weeks and really think about it. Like it makes you do a lot of deep soul searching, but it's well worth it. And just build with purpose and know where you're going with it.
I think that's underutilized. I think a lot of people get shiny object syndrome.
Yeah.
But I think when you set your mind on what you want to do by working backwards, this is what I'm looking, think about your future you, right? What is that perfect world that you want to operate in, right? I want to be $1 billion company, blah, 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 blah. And then you got to work towards that goal is an easier way to go about it than reading about fix and flip, then reading about multifamily, then reading about turnkey, right? You could easily take your eye off the prize, but at the same time, understand who that future you is and then build the business to be that future you. Now that doesn't mean that future you is always going to be you. You might change 6 months in, 12 months in, but if you don't have that plan out of the box, that's when, you're spending 3 to 6 months on every single thing you do. And you're never advancing the ball down the field. So I think that's important to realize, if you want to be completely remote and work, you got to look at something different than if you want to be in the trenches, battling the day to day, right? Now, not saying everybody wants to do that or the other, but understanding what your skill set is and what and the right situation for you is super important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think the worry too that I have with that conversation is people want to pick one thing and think they've got to be that person forever. And I think there's a lot of unnecessary thought in that, where it's very easy to just shift or transition or go into something else. I mean, anybody that's listened to any podcasts, I would say 90+% of the people started in one thing and then eventually found their footing in another. It's very rare that you hear the person, I was like, oh, I started flipping house and that's all I've done for 30 years. Even if that's what they've done for 30 years, oftentimes they've branched out into other things. They've tried different things. They've added different things to it. It's very rare that somebody just picks the right thing on the first go and figures it out, right? I think there's also, I have no idea what it is, but I think it's pretty crazy high how many people change their major in college. It's the same thing, right? You get to college, you got 4 years, you got to pick something. There's a lot of people that change because there's nothing wrong with it, right? What you thought isn't actually what you thought, and you're not going to know until you try it. So I think that's a big component of it too, of like not fearing getting pigeonholed into one thing and not liking it.
Yeah. Well, life changes too. Like John wants to hang out with his kids. I want to hang out with my kids. 5 years ago, there were no kids. So maybe you had more time to, knock on doors and do whatever strategy you're doing. And it's time to switch gears. And you guys have probably found the same thing. Like a portfolio will go through several different phases. There's the growth phase, and then you consolidate it. And then either people will choose to wind it down or shift into the preservation legacy mode where they're trying to pass it on the most efficient way. It's okay to switch gears. Like, as somebody's growing their portfolio, they're going to be making different decisions than if they're just consolidating and holding. So yeah, like I don't know where I could go off on a tangent forever, but like, it's just having vision gives you clarity, but you don't have to be married to it. Like, you can always change your mind. Like, there's enough real estate out there, and the strategies and the ways to do it. There's a million different ways you can slice and dice it.
So that at the end of the day, right, you can get laser focused and miss a ton of opportunities. At the end of the day, everybody on this recording and this video, and almost every single person, if not every single person we've interviewed, we're entrepreneurs. And part of being an entrepreneur is fucking something up dramatically, but rebounding from that, right? And that could be 3 months and changing your mind, right? Because it's the visionary and the person that executes, right? In the entrepreneur chair, you got to be a little bit of a visionary. You got to think differently. If you didn't think differently, you'd be corporate America going through the steps, right? You just do what you're programmed to do. So there's nothing wrong with getting focus, but losing that focus, it's not the end of the world. The problem is when you lose the focus and you never execute on anything. I think that's the thing every one of us would agree is you can change your mind, right? That's okay. But if you keep changing your mind and you've never made a mistake or you've never executed, that's when you have to step back and realize, am I doing what I want to do? Like you said, having a kid is a major change. When I first set out my goal, I didn't have a kid. I didn't even think of having a kid. I wanted a kid, but I never had one. I could have taken one, right? But it doesn't work that way. So, but when that happens, it changes everything. So now your goal is now changed. And it could be another life event. It doesn't have to be having a kid. It could be getting married. It could be getting a boyfriend or girlfriend. It could be just you bought a property and you just fell in love with your day-to-day on that property. So just understand that it's nice to get focused, but don't execute on something. I think that's at the end of the day. Execute on something. If you love it, do it again. If you hate it, pivot. But don't just not execute, because not executing, that's like the excuse you can make on why you keep changing your mind. At the end of the day, you want to get focused and you want to execute. And if you want to do real estate, pick something and try it. And if it fails, pick something else or realize what you failed. And I think that's what, the root of it gets down to.
Yeah, for sure.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I keep saying, my 10-year vision is to get to 500 million under management. But my asterisk to that is always, I may decide in 5 years to say, fuck that. I don't want investors. I don't want a management platform. And I just want to have my own portfolio and live on a beach somewhere and totally change. But it's not stopping me from putting a 10-year plan in place and chasing after it, because I just don't care. I'll just change. And good chance I will change, right? It's a good chance my 10-year plan will change, either because I'm coming in lower, I'm coming in way higher, or I just feel like it for one reason or another. So it's, you don't necessarily need a 10-year plan, but having something to follow is really important.
Yeah, it's like a guideline or a North Star, or if you are working towards a common goal, you have a better shot at getting there than if you're just going through the blind. Like, I might have spoken about this on another podcast, but like there was a test. I think it was in Clockwork, the Mike McAllowitz, but where they blindfolded people and they have people walk the short end of a football field. So instead of going 100 yards, you go 50 yards. And if you put a blindfold on, you basically never get from sideline to sideline. You start going in circles, whereas if you have a target that you're reaching for, you can make your way through it, good, bad, or indifferent. At least okay, I did good, I didn't do good. So, but when you have no idea, you typically end up just going in circles. And that's when you look back and say, oh shit, what could I have done? So I think that to that point, that's really what you're looking to accomplish. Is anything 10 years, 5 years, 100 years can change, but at least you're working towards a common goal.
100%. Love it. I think that's a really awesome place to wrap up and kind of conclude there. So Seth, thank you so much for coming on and, sharing your knowledge, your opinions, your insights, et cetera. If people want to learn more about you, get in touch with you, follow you, where can they do all that stuff?
Yeah, for sure. Best place to go is sethferguson.org. Don't go to .com. That's an evangelical preacher. And then you can also find me on YouTube, youtube.com/Seth Ferguson. And if you guys don't mind, I'd like to shout out for the multifamily conference happening.
Go for it.
May 14th and 15th in Toronto, 2022, Corona free. And you can go to multifamilyconference.ca for that.
Gotcha. Love it. Guys, definitely go check it out. Definitely keep your eye on the conference. I swear to God, if we are not out of this by then, got bigger things to worry about. So, fingers crossed, most likely, hopefully it'll be a really nice conference to go check out and a, good trip for everybody. But thank you so much, guys, for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you're not already subscribed, it would mean the world to John and I if you would do so. And if you are, please send it to someone that would get a tremendous amount of value from this episode. Seth, once again, thank you so much for coming on. This is amazing.
Yeah, my pleasure, guys. Thanks so much.